This week on the Retirement Quick Tips podcast, I'm talking about America's $36 trillion tab on the national debt and what that means for you. Today, I'm talking about how you can prepare and protect yourself from a potential debt doom loop from the US government. Okay, so in a debt doom loop, the government's unsustainable debt load eventually creates a situation where more and more and more of the revenue coming in goes to service the debt, just to pay the interest on the debt. That's already happening. Higher debt coupled with now higher interest rates puts an enormous strain on government spending. So they must pay interest on the debt. They have to keep issuing the debt because they haven't reined in their spending. They haven't increased taxes enough to bring in more money either. So they have to continue to issue new debt at higher rates just to keep paying the debt. If you're the federal government, you cannot stop paying the interest on the debt. That's called a default. And then we have much worse problems. They usually need to cut services, increase tax revenue, some combination of the two. That's really the path forward and the way out of the debt doom loop. But the increased taxes, cuts in services, that's all just a downward spiral that usually results in a combination of three things that just feed on itself, hence the loop that make it difficult to get out of. So you have this lower economic growth. That is the real problem here, because if you have lower economic growth, you don't have as much tax revenue coming in because people and businesses, they're not making as much money as they used to. The trend is lower, but the government, again, they have interest to pay. They have bills to pay of their own. They have to keep sending those Social Security checks. So they need to raise taxes, which results in further economic growth, or I should say lack thereof, lackluster growth. So it hinders the economy even more. And that is the doom loop. Then you have lower spending. They have to cut things. And realistically, you look at where a third of the federal government spends money right now, Social Security and Medicare. So I want to be clear that although I believe we are headed for a crisis situation with our national debt, I don't think this is imminent. And I did talk yesterday about an interesting article in Barron's that kind of lays a pretty good argument, a pretty good case for why we may never enter a crisis. However, that is heavily reliant on a Congress and the federal government in general to have significantly more discipline. And that's the primary reason why I think a crisis is imminent. Because even if you have an economic boom from AI, which is the Cliff's Notes version of what I talked about yesterday, you're probably just buying time. So it may not come to pass. We may not have a debt crisis in the next 5 or 10 or even 20 years, but I do think it's coming because any politician who tries to tackle the debt is committing political suicide. And with politicians so divided, I think it's really interesting how the media and the left attacked the Doge project because it's a worthwhile project. And anybody with eyes to see and isn't so clouded by their hatred of Trump to see that it is a good thing. We need to tackle government spending. We need to tackle the low-hanging fruit of the fraud and all the waste. And unfortunately, the Doge project is sort of doomed to fail because it is so politically charged. But it is needed, and it's needed to continue. And I hope it does continue because any politician who tries to tackle the debt is committing political suicide. So you sort of need this other entity like Doge to say, look here, people, we got to deal with this problem and we need to deal with it sooner rather than later. Because no politician is going to campaign on promises of higher taxes and cuts to entitlements and benefits, Social Security, Medicare. Let's cut all these entitlements. No one's going to get elected. So the easy way out politically is just to keep whistling past the graveyard, increasing the debt. And that's what's led to the problem we're in and why we need something like Doge, or at least a disciplined Congress to stop with the spending and to figure out how we're going to get our way out of this mess. Because it's two ways: higher tax revenue, reduced spending, probably a combination of both. And there's a number of ways that you could do that. Like I talked to yesterday about, you could bring in more revenue without raising taxes directly, but you need strong, robust, sustained economic growth to do that. Now, one way that you can prepare for a debt crisis or this kind of unsustainable path of higher debt that we're in is it is likely that interest rates are not going back to where they were. Now, you will see interest rates go up and down, sure, that will happen. But the higher interest rate environment that we're in, I think it's pretty sticky. So I think that because the debt is higher, that's going to keep rates higher. The federal government is going to have to pay higher rates to get people to buy the debt. They can't issue new treasury bonds at 2% anymore like they were doing for years and years. No, it's more like 5%. So retirees will actually benefit somewhat from this because higher interest rates mean that you can buy bonds and get a higher rate on your bonds. So retirees generally benefit from higher interest rates, everything else being equal, because most retirees, they don't have a lot of debt to service. You don't have a lot of car loans, credit card loans, student loans to service. The higher rates benefit you because you have less debt compared to your assets. And if you position your investments towards owning bonds, which a lot of retirees do, then you benefit from that higher interest rate environment. So another trend of higher debt is that higher inflation is also more likely. I'm not talking about like runaway, crazy hyperinflation, but I'm just talking about this sticky, higher than what we're used to. Maybe inflation in the 3 to 4% range versus the 2% that we've been used to. Now, no one talks about this all that much, but if the government allows for higher inflation, that makes paying off the debt cheaper because they've issued this fixed debt. They issued it at a certain rate. But if over the course of the time from when they issue it to when they're paying it off, inflation goes up, they have inflated dollars that are used to pay off this fixed rate loan that they issued. The same thing is true with like any other debt. If you have a mortgage and your income goes up, it makes it a lot cheaper to pay off the mortgage the more time that goes on because of inflation. If everything else is equal, inflated dollars that are used to pay off fixed rate debt makes the debt problem less bad. So you want to protect yourself against what I would say is a slightly elevated inflationary environment. Again, I'm not trying to sound the alarm here because I think that's unrealistic, but higher inflation, a little bit elevated. Let's just call it elevated inflation. Now that doesn't help bonds because those bonds that you own, they're paying a fixed rate. So we can't have everything in bonds because inflation is going to eat away at that. But other assets, Treasury inflation protection securities or TIPS, which have the inflation component, those are attractive in an inflationary environment. Owning real estate, owning stocks, those are good counterforces against higher sticky inflation. So going back to kind of these principles of prudent investing, owning some bonds, owning stocks, focusing on quality, that's another thing. Investors are going to need to be a lot more careful about owning quality companies over just sort of broad investing, broad market investing, like buying an index fund and just like setting it and forgetting it. That can work when the economy is broadly doing well. But in a slower growth economy, you're going to have a lot more companies out there that get flushed out. So you're going to have consolidation. By the way, this is already happening. The amount of publicly traded companies, if you go back and compare how many publicly traded companies there are today to like 20, 30 years ago, it's actually less. There's already been consolidation because it's harder to compete. So the largest companies, like they have, take the lion's share. The barriers to entry become a lot higher. You have regulation, you have higher taxes, you have a less robust economy. And if we have slower economic growth because of this weighty debt burden that we have, that coupled with higher interest rates is going to just flush out a lot more businesses. You'll be left with fewer good options. Investors can still make money in stocks, but I think quality over just broadly investing in a general market index fund is going to produce better results, in my humble opinion. Okay, higher taxes. How do we insulate against that? I don't know. Some people out there would recommend, Roth conversions, get money out of your traditional IRAs into Roth. I think that could make sense. However, what if the government changes how a Roth is taxed later on, or they put some caps on it or something? So you are still at the mercy of future unknown tax changes. It is very tricky to do any advanced planning in this area if we have no idea how taxes are going to evolve, even from year to year, let alone how that's going to shape up in the future if the government gets to a point where they're going to have to seriously start raising tax revenue. There's lots of different levers they can pull to do that. So trying to plan for that now, I think, is a fool's errand. So I think it's better to adjust as things evolve. All right, cuts to Medicare and Social Security. This is the big, bad, scary one that everyone seems to be worried about. But of all the reasons to be worried about the national debt and going back to, how do you prepare for this? How do you protect yourself? I'm actually the least worried about this one, mostly because so many Americans, about 75 million Americans, rely on Social Security. 65 million Americans are enrolled in Medicare. Cutting benefits for this many Americans, that's only going to happen after every other option has been completely exhausted. And even then, I would expect smaller cuts, or maybe your cost of living adjustments aren't as much. They don't keep up with inflation, but those checks and those benefits are not going to stop. And anyone who ever says so obviously doesn't understand how revolutions work, because if you have 75 million people in the United States who are getting their Social Security taken away, you're going to have retirees in the streets throwing Molotov cocktails and overthrowing the government. That's what's going to happen. So more likely, if benefits get cut, it's likely to be for people like me who are much further away from retirement. Also, raising the retirement age, that's actually a pretty easy way, really, to close that shortfall. If they just raise it from age 67 to 68, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, they looked at the various options, and that one takes care of like 13% of the Social Security shortfall, definitely has an impact. If you increase payroll taxes by 2 percentage points, that actually took care of over half of the shortfall in Social Security. So it has a huge impact. So again, higher taxes likely on the horizon to deal with the debt problems, unless the economy can experience just phenomenal growth. And then maybe we have some other options out of this mess. So again, going back to higher taxes, I think it's reasonable to prepare for an environment of future slower economic growth, lower returns from your investments than what we've had, and higher taxes. All of which means you may need to adjust your spending and lifestyle decisions in retirement if all of this comes to pass. Okay, today I went on exceptionally long. But again, it's important. How do we prepare? There's some things you can do, most of which is out of your control, but hopefully I laid out a roadmap for some things you can begin to do today to insulate yourself down the road. All right, that's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. My name is Ashley Michike, and this is the Retirement Quick Tips Podcast.